Okay, last time we left off here at cognition. We were introducing cognition to you and about ready to get started on memory, if I remember correctly. So let's flip through it. We looked at working memory and recall and thinking through a process and what cognition is, which means to know and to understand something. We looked at how the brain associates memory and groups it and organizes it so that we have a better chance of making good decisions when we're going through this cognition process. We looked at perception leading to memory, which then hopefully leads at some point to controlling your executive functions, where you're able to plan and think and work through the process of attention and multitasking, and hopefully find a cognitive state where you can take action towards your goals, which is really what we're looking at here. Now, I left off at this slide with my son and the computer that we built, and I believe I was saying that he had a chance to do this once, but if we built a computer every Christmas break, every holiday break, we decided we were going to put together a computer, would that be something that he rehearsed so much that as he got older, being able to put together, order the parts and put together a computer would be like simple for him, be easy to do? I would think it would be. So let's look at the model of memory. This is Atkinson-Shiffrin model, 1968. And it's kind of a basic model and look at just the process. Now, obviously memory works differently, but this is the idea behind how it functions. So it's a multi-store model, meaning there's multi-storage areas, and there's an explanation here. It tries to explain how memory processes work. You see, you hear, you feel many things, but only a small number of things are really remembered, or at least we seem to have access to anyway. Atkinson and Shiffrin originally proposed their dual storage model, which is what's on top there, which is short-term memory and long-term memory. But it has undergone a bunch of adjustments, and the most recent adjustments at the bottom. I think I mentioned this last time, and if I didn't, I really want to highly recommend the video here. It's 30 minutes long. It does focus on Cahill and McGaw, like we're going to discuss here some, but I think it's essential for having a deep and meaningful understanding of memory. One person I haven't highlighted and spoken about too much is the Nobel Prize winning cognitive psychologist and scientist. His name is going to skip right through my head here. I know it. He is a part of the brain series with Charlie Rose, and I'm going to look it up real quick just because I feel kind of stupid not thinking of his name. I've actually had an opportunity to email him and ask him some questions. He was somebody who was working on this series, and it was a pretty cool series, basically looking at the brain the brain and different types of issues and problems with it. Boy, his name's right on the tip of my tongue. See how memory works? But at charlierose.com, it's sort of there's his name right there. Eric Candel is his name. He's from the Columbia University. And Eric Candel was a person who was able to win the Nobel Prize by looking at memory systems. And one of the things that he looked at was a very simple animal, kind of like almost like a slug or something similar to that. Let's look it up here and I'll tell you for sure. But he was able to look at a simple memory system and the simple ways that it worked and functioned, especially as far as there it is, the aplasia. It's a sea slug with very large nerve cells. So he was able to look at those very large nerve cells to determine and kind of relate it back to human functioning. And so how do our nerve cells work similarly? But I emailed Dr. Candel, actually emailed Charlie, and then they emailed me back because I had asked if they were going to do a show on multiple sclerosis. And the crazy thing was that the next day they were going to be recording it. I wasn't entirely super pleased with the show. Somebody who has MS, it was overly positive about how great the impact of all these new cures and other things are going, and I doubt that they're very much cures. Let's look and see. Not much in here about him other than the fact that he won the Nobel Prize in that area for looking at medicine. There isn't a Nobel Prize for psychology, so he won the prize in physiology or medicine, that category, for a physiological basis of memory stores in neurons. And to me, I mean, that's about as close as you can get to saying that a psychologist won the prize. So something to think about there. A very interesting gentleman, and he's really something. And he's featured in here along with Cahill and some others. They will walk through the process of how memory works. So long story short, I think this is a good video to check out. So how does memory work? It's the encoding and the storage and the retrieval. Harkening right back to the model we looked at just a second ago, the SAM model. In short, these are the processes by which we do these things. We get information inside of our brain, we encode it. Many people would use like a keyboard or mouse or something like that. This is the way you would get the information into your computer, and that's encoding. And then we'd hang on to it and store it. And another way of looking at that is that this portable hard drive is a storage unit. If we plug this in, it's kind of like maybe working memory. We're working off of this, and we're able to store information and memory into our brain or neurons, and just like you would a hard drive. It's an analogy, it's not perfect, but we'd be able to get it back and retrieve it by going and finding the right location, the proper spots for it. For example, like the computers that we use, most of them use a model based upon, and I'll pull one up here, based upon working off of a filing system. So I'll pull up the file. This is called files in my operating system. So you go here, I'll come up to the top for files, and you can create a new window, make a bookmark. And bookmarks are kind of interesting because you'd remember where things are. So if I want to go into music and create a bookmark there, I click bookmark. In some ways, that bookmark that I'm creating to remember where something is, okay, if I create a bookmark here, it's interesting because what you'll end up doing is remembering where a certain location is, and you're doing that kind of in context. So are there really folders in a computer? There aren't really folders in a computer. There aren't really even pictures in the computer like this album cover. They're just ones and zeros. It's just information. But we're able to manipulate that information to show context and the storage and know where things are located on the computer and pull them up to access them. And in a large way, it's kind of like that with your brain. You're going to learn information better if, as you're encoding it, you're putting it in a place kind of tied together with other pieces of information that makes sense to you, so that when you think about the other piece of information, you're able to access it and pull it out a little bit easier. And we'll see that as we go through here. But let's start with this. Can you name the 7 dwarves? On a separate sheet of paper, write in your notes, just write down as many as you can. And I'm going to pause the video for a second. When we come right back, we will look and see how many you got. Okay, how'd you do? Did you get all the 7 dwarves? And it's interesting because of the picture of them there. So you could look at the picture and maybe even figure this out. So it isn't like you're pulling it up without any information in your mind. So let's see how many you got correct. Of course, there's grumpy, sneezy, doc, happy, dopey, bashful, and sleepy. So if you got all 7, that's pretty impressive. And maybe if you got all 7, you are someone who's watched Snow White and the 7 Dwarfs before. I think that might be part of this. You might need to be able to do that. How long ago did you watch the movie? Was it just this summer? You were babysitting some kids, or you have a brother or sister and they were watching it, and so, or maybe you're just a Disney freak and like to watch those a lot. I'm not making any judgments here. You're allowed to do that. And how long, or how loud, sorry, or distracting were the people in the house as you're watching this video and you're trying to do that activity? I mean, if you've got loud music on, or brother or sister or mom or dad are yelling or screaming at you, or you've got a dog that suddenly wakes up barking, as my dog likes to do sometimes as you watch some of these videos, and you were startled, maybe you wouldn't remember them as well. Let's look at superior autobiographical memory. We've looked at this in class, or we will. This is also termed hyperthymesia. Jill Price was the first person to have this. I don't know if you'd want to call it condition or disorder. I think it's a disorder because it's not normal for somebody to be able to do this. She has the ability to recall pretty much anything that's happened to her with tremendous accuracy. If she can remember something, she probably will remember it correctly. So these are kinds of details of everyday life, things that she's experienced. Obviously, she's not like clairvoyant or some mystic where she knows of things that happened in, say, France, when she's grown up in New York or Los Angeles or something. I mean, what happens in her daily life, she's aware of. Dr. James McGaugh, he is the guy down there on the left. He was someone that Joe Price went to try to figure out what exactly was happening with her. She kind of feels like, and you can kind of see her in the picture up here in her house, she kind of feels like this has been something that's haunted her. And you can kind of continue to see the fact that it's difficult for her even today. Like the last photograph or image that I saw of her or video that was just produced in the last year, she's gained a tremendous amount of weight. It seems like the weight of maybe knowing what's up with her and the publicity has caused her even more, or maybe the fame too, because I'm sure that people would recognize her potentially if they've seen her on television. She's been on some shows and she's written this book, and her initial idea was to try to help people. She went to the grocery store and a woman was there who was just completely cognitively confused and disoriented, and she thought to herself, how can this person be lacking the ability to remember things and understand the world around her, and I've got this brain that won't stop. And you might think, well, geez, what is she complaining about? But if you're somebody like Jill, who lost her husband and she's had some other tough breaks in her life, she remembers these things and relives them like they just happened yesterday, or last week, or the pain of those things is pretty sharp for her. So she was the first that they were able to diagnose to have this condition. And James McGaugh, and at the bottom we'll look at Cahill as well. They're colleagues who worked on this with Jill Price to try to identify her, and they kind of came up with a test to see if she has a superior memory. But he was kind of famous for studying the amygdala in rats, and that's the small little almond-shaped part of your brain that we've learned before can be an emotional center of the brain. So McGaugh learned that more about how we can enhance memory by studying rats and trying to activate this area and see what kind of effect it has. So he would give the rat a drug that would emulate the effects of a stress hormone. I think it was adrenaline, and then it would help the rat remember in a stronger way. So, for example, you can kind of see the picture there of the rat kind of swimming. So it's in this circular pool, and there's one little platform in the middle that the rat could sit on, and the rat doesn't know where it is. You put the rat in there at first, and it swims around the outside, tries to find it, finally finds the thing in the middle, and then it gets up and it's not in the water and swimming around anymore. So it took the rat a while to do that. So you pull the rat out, you give it a shot of adrenaline, you put the rat in like the next day. The rat would find the center pod in place to stand and get out of the water almost immediately, right to it. It was an amazing thing to watch, and I've seen some video of it. The other rats who were in the control group who were not given adrenaline, it's almost like it was just like the first time they'd ever done this. They had the same discovery process, so they weren't remembering as quickly. So the amygdala and kind of stimulating it with the stress hormone that would produce, it became a way to firmly fix and retain a memory. So, but without the amygdala, if we didn't have that there to kind of measure the emotional response to things that happened to us, we may remember things like, I may remember losing my dad or my mother-in-law when they passed away, just the same equal amount as, say, I didn't get tots with my Sonic order tonight, which I didn't. I was like, what the heck? These guys get my order wrong all the time. I don't know why I go back there. But it's interesting that this little almond-shaped part of your brain that's so kind of tiny would have such a big effect. It's kind of nuts. So I have in the notes here embedded all these videos. So this is the first part of The Woman Who Could Not Forget, Joe Price. It's about 9 minutes long. We typically see this in class. And then there are 2 parts here on superior autobiographical memory. We watch these in class because I like to talk you through them. There are parts that I think are really relevant to what we're studying and understanding how this can affect people. But remember and keep in mind that we study disorder many times in psychology so that we can somehow trace it back in kind of a backwards design here and try to figure out how a healthy person would operate and function. So William James said, "Selection is the very keel on which our mental ship is built, and in the case of memory, its utility is obvious." And here's the key. If we remembered everything, we should on most occasions be as ill off as if we remembered nothing. And that quote I kind of copied right from Cahill, Dr. Larry Cahill, and off his website at the university he teaches at. He has that quote right on there. And this seems contradictory in the cases of the superbrain like Bradley Williams or the amazing Mary Lou Henner, the Hollywood actress, who also shares this condition where she has superior autobiographical memory. These folks do not seem like they're struggling in many ways. Now, Joe Price says that she is, and she's more open about it. She's even said she should probably be in a mental institution. She feels like this drives her crazy. But a lot of the folks who have this, Mary Lou Henner is one of them for sure, who says that they wouldn't trade this for anything. They love their memory. It makes them feel like they're special and different. Yet emotionally, and the attachments they have with other people, this may be a big issue. I know the 5 people that they interviewed on the 60 Minutes program, which was right here, there were 5 people, including this woman, who said that she does struggle with personal relationships with other people, that it's sometimes difficult because she's going to remember every single thing that was said, and if you get in an argument, she's going to be able to say, well, you said this, and you said that, and then you did this, and I think it would be difficult. This does not seem to be the case for most of these superior autobiographical memory persons. They remember everything, at least autobiographically, but they do not seem to be struggling. So how does memory work? Larry Cahill and James McGaugh have made some big breakthroughs. Of course, kind of piggybacking off of the work that others have done before them, but they have extended things for sure, like the amygdala and the hippocampus, 2 areas that they've focused in on. Amygdala, the small almond-shaped region of the brain near the hippocampus. You can see it kind of labeled there really pretty well in the videos. But Cahill conducted experiments in which subjects were shown slides of varying emotional content, and immediately after watching the slides, they immersed their arm into ice water. And this would be a shocking thing if you've ever put yourself in ice water, it can be pretty shocking. I used to, kind of sit in ice water baths or stand in a big tub of ice water during college because my legs were just killing me from football practice, and from football camp we'd have 2 or 3 practices a day. It was pretty brutal. And in the very beginning of that, I'd have a towel, and that you would think that's because I'm in this ice water pool and I'm going to need that towel for that. But mostly it was for kind of biting onto the towel because there was so much pain involved in the first time you jump in there. And it did make it feel better after a while, but that initial pain was it really sparked your negative emotions, that's for sure. So what they found out here is this immersion into the ice water triggers a stress hormone response, much like what McGaw had seen in rats with the adrenaline, which in turn then enhanced the subject's memory of the slides that they were watching on emotional content. Subjects who endured this ice water for a full 3 minutes recalled the emotional slides more clearly than did the control subjects whose arms were not immersed in water. So it seems like pretty solid evidence here that the amygdala does come into play. This is similar to flashbulb memories, which we'll see here in a little bit. Cahill also did some pretty fascinating work on the differences between men and women. And so it says here, whose brain, his or hers. Researchers have found that the amygdala reacts differently in men and women when viewing emotionally arousing images. So, the right amygdala showed the most activity in men, resulting in most accurate recall when men responded strongly to emotional material. Studies suggested men are more likely to remember the gist of emotional events. They're going to remember maybe not the details, but they're going to remember the summary, the overall idea. Women, their left amygdala showed the most activity, resulting in the most accurate recall. And when women responded strongly to emotional material, they're more likely to remember details of emotional events. So very interesting. I always think of it this way: if you're a typical man and woman, and it matches the study that Cahill's done here. If a man and wife are in an accident, the man is maybe going to be able to describe the speed he was going, was there a red light, how many cars were there, and these factual things happen and give you kind of a run through of, well, there's an accident because he didn't do this or he didn't do that. They're going to give you the gist of the emotional events. The women are more likely to remember the details, emotional events and details of it. So things that maybe a man wouldn't quite think were important, like she noticed the person didn't have their turn signal on, or she might have noticed that the street was wet because there had been rain earlier that day, so the streets were soaked, or whatever. I mean, a woman would maybe pick up on some of these things, and this is just based on science, not just based on stereotypes. But Cahill's quote was this: throughout evolution, women have had to deal with a number of internal stressors, like childbirth, that men haven't had to experience. And what he's saying here is, what's fascinating about this is the brain seems to have evolved to be in tune with those different stressors. And we've seen this in other cases as well. But the findings here could help researchers learn more about sex-related differences. And I like to term that gender-related differences, because that's really what we're talking about here, not the other. But I don't know. Maybe when they put the word sex in there, more people will read it. I'm not sure why they do that. But it's gender-based. It's men or women. And such problems like anxiety, autism, depression, IBS, phobias, and post-traumatic stress disorder. So the amygdala, this cluster of neurons found on both sides of the brain, you have to remember there's two of them, it's kind of mirrored that way, and involved with both of the genders and hormones and other involuntary functions, as well as emotions and perceptions. And now, and as Cahill had seen before, use different sides of their brain to process and store long-term memories. So he's showing that even with a particular drug that they've been able to create and test, it can block memory differently in men and women. And you can do this on this blocking of memory. We'll see that in a second here. But scans showed men and women's amygdalas are polar opposites, and the right amygdala is much more active and shows more connections with other brain regions. And for women, it's the flip. It's the reverse. It's the left is. Let's look at the three types of or parts of memory, the memory system. Information from the environment is encoded when it enters the body through the senses. We've looked at sensation and perception. So you've got visual, acoustic, and semantic encoding. Visual is most effective, as we have mentioned. It's the strongest of our senses, or the one that we gain the most information from, just naturally. But the most successful way to encode is by combining all three ways. So I try to explain this to new teachers when I work with them, which I used to do a lot, is that don't think that you have one certain way of teaching and that's going to help your students learn the material. Presenting it in multiple ways is probably the best, because that's what the brain wants. It wants to see all three of these areas highlighted or sparked. So this would be like a computer taking input from a keyboard, mouse, or touchscreen, or a smartphone tablet, as we've mentioned before. Basically, your brain, if it could be plugged in, these 100 trillion synapses, which are the points where nerve cells in the human brain connect with other cells, got all these synapses, and they're making connections. That's sort of like the file creation or the writing to a hard drive that that kind of storage unit would do. So let's look at storage itself. And what we'll find out here is there's three types: sensory memory, short-term memory, and long-term memory. And a lot of us kind of familiar with this. This is that SAM model again. But STM, or short-term memory, or working memory, has a limit not only on the number of items it can hold, but also the duration, which is about 20 seconds. And we've seen the story of the man who had his brain, he had problems with the lower part of his brain, and his hippocampus was removed. He had no short-term to long-term storage for his memory. And so everything that would happen to him is with 7 to 30-second increments, and then he wouldn't remember what happened before that. He was always living in the present. The use of rehearsal for a regular person would help to increase the likelihood that these memories would be recalled. And a really simple way to do this is just have someone give them your phone number, or give you their phone number. And when they do that, you can't just remember it by just being told it once. You're going to have to recite it in your brain, or even think about some ways or methods to use to encode it in a way that you're familiar with. And we're going to get to those. But long-term memory is divided into explicit, like knowing facts, and implicit memories, like remembering how to move your body when you're walking. So if you are dancing and you've learned this dance and you've worked to know how to do, I don't know, the tango, and you've been dancing and dancing and dancing, and then you go out dancing with another person who also knows the tango, most of the time you're not having to worry about how to do that dance. It's already sort of in your memory. That is implicit. It just flows from you. Walking is another one of those things. Of course, I have to think about that sometimes. But most of us is like walking and chewing gum at the same time. Most of us can do an implicit memory. Explicit is a little bit different. This is when you have your knowing facts involved, and this is like learning information for history. Like you've got a set of dates to know, or you're trying to kind of cram information for a test. You're going to be funneling things into explicit memory. Implicit is going to just come naturally after you've learned it. So let's look at retrieval. How do you get it out of your brain? There are all kind of tricks for this. But the key to accessing and getting this information out from long-term memory is to have an appropriate retrieval cue. And mnemonics can help with that. Memory aid that relies on reorganization of information for easy retrieval. Songs, other ways of doing this. I know Ms. Welsh, she used to teach, I think it was biology, and she would have her kids sing this Wheels on the Bus song, but it was all about the parts of the cell. And that helped them understand it and learn it. The encoding specificity or transfer of appropriate processing transfer, appropriate processing. The retrieval's better when the context we are in and the context we are trying to retrieve is something that matches the context in which it was learned. So this can be as much as like you're chewing a specific flavor of gum when you do math, and you're practicing math at home and you're doing your homework, and you're chewing Wrigley's Spearmint gum, and that's the only time you chew that gum is when you're doing math. When you get to school, you have a stick of that and you're working on your test. The encoding specificity would say that the context in which you learned it, which those flavors were kind of activated then, those flavors being activated again would help you maybe remember it. That's a small way, but there's another way of looking at this too, like the context, understanding like the events around it, whether it's point of view or the context could be like which subject it is. Context is a part of the overall memory, and by restating that context when the retrieval is occurring, we're creating an optimal recall situation, which means that, what does this mean? It means context is super important. This is a movie trailer. I'm not going to play it for you here, but it might not be a bad idea to check it out. This would be a really good one for extra credit. It's called Memento. Pretty interesting movie where this gentleman here, I think he was just recently the bad guy in Iron Man 3. And this is Carrie-Anne Moss, who was the person who was in The Matrix. Well, he has no long-term memory. Everything is short-term and he loses it. It never sticks. And so he has tattooed his body with what he'd call long-term memories. He's taken Polaroid pictures of other things that he carries around with him to give him messages. His wife has been killed, and he's trying to go through this process of, like a detective trying to figure out the case, yet he has this amnesia where he cannot remember. So pretty difficult situation for him, and it's a really interesting movie with lots of twists. So let's look at some other mnemonics. Homeland Security fighting terrorism since 1492. And you see the picture there of Native Americans. Of course, in 1492 they didn't have guns, but the context here is they're Americans. They're the Homeland Security. I mean, Europeans that came over here weren't here first. So, in a way, they're the original Homeland Security. The order of operations mnemonics. Please excuse my dear Aunt Sally. So parenthesis, exponents, multiplication, division, addition, subtraction. It's a way to remember these. 30 days hath September, April, June, and November. All the rest have 31, save February with 28 days clear and 29 each leap year. So that's a way to remember the number of days in a month. And we all probably have seen FACE, EG, BDF in different ways. This one says, all cars eat gas and good burritos don't fall apart. Pretty interesting. Let's look at flashbulb memories. These are ones that seem to be seared into our mind. We are certain, and we understand for certain, boy, I remember everything that happened on 9/11. Looks like it was yesterday because it was such an event and such a terrible tragedy. And you often hear these words said, where were you when? Whether it's Pearl Harbor, the John F. Kennedy assassination, the Challenger explosion in 1986, and I remember where I was on January 20th, 1986. I remember exactly where I was for sure. I was 16 years old, and I think I had stayed home that day, or if I didn't stay home, I remember watching the news and seeing clips of it. But did I remember that way? I mean, did that really happen that day? I have no idea. Maybe I think I recall watching the news about this because I have seen news clips since then, and so I just figured that I had seen those news clips on that day. That's happened with 9/11 a little bit. There were some images that came out about, I think it was the first building that had a plane that flew into it in New York City. And that footage didn't come out for a long, long, long time Yet today, if you feel like you had seen that on that day and you're remembering it that way, you're remembering it incorrectly. So flashbulbs are, the old big flash on the camera like the guy has there on the John F. Kennedy deal. I should point this way. It's over there on the left. It's interesting what it does, because although people believe these memories are complete and accurate and perfect in some ways, they're just as flawed as the stored memories that we pull up every single day in less emotional situations. And over time, they're less and less accurate. And this suggests a little bit of what we've discussed in class and seen in the article, that when you are discussing your memories with other people, you're kind of putting on a show and you're telling a story and you're sprucing things up and jazzing it up, and the amygdala gets involved in the emotional center where you're trying to express a social connection with other people and have them appreciate you. What ends up happening is that you may twist, change, or tweak your story. Well, that seems like not a big deal. But the more that you do that, the more it gets written back to your own brain, and then that's the memory kind of seared into your brain. The next time you bring it up, it's easy to recall those new facts because that's what you believe really happened. So interesting stuff, flashbulb memories, but it's important to realize that they're not any more accurate than other memories, yet we have the sense that they are because we went through that very stressful time period. So if there was something you could take after experiencing a painful or traumatic event that would permanently weaken your memory of the event that just happened, would you take it? And this is a very interesting one as far as PTSD is concerned. It's post-traumatic stress disorder. Leslie Stahl reports on this one again on 60 Minutes, that it's an idea that may not be so far off. In fact, we've seen some success with it in certain patients. Trauma victims could be filled with hope because they're no longer going to have these terrible feelings of stress that they felt previously. So I'm not sure where that's going, but there may be a day where you could take a pill and kind of erase certain memories or have them dulled. Sight, taste, touch, hearing, and smell. Those are your incoming senses, and they go into sensory memory. They can be in sensory memory for a very short period of time, less than minutes in some cases. But if you spend time attending to those and paying attention to them, they get passed on to working memory. We can have 4 to 7 items, around 4 to 7, up to a minute without rehearsal that we can kind of recall. With rehearsal, that number gets much bigger. And with rehearsal, you will have some encoding happening. This is where it'll get into long-term memory, large quantities of information, and potentially unlimited duration of information. And we've seen people do some amazing things, like memorize pi, and they memorized pi all the way out, that it took them, and they completely went through the number and spoke it for a 24-hour period. I believe that is the Guinness Book of World Record for memory. An Asian gentleman did that a few years ago, and you can look that information up. But declarative facts are broken up into episodic events, which are events, times, plates, dates, that sort of thing. And semantic are the knowing and meaning ones, where you're connecting concepts and facts and relationships. Things like King Cow's fly, what's the capital of France? Procedural skills on the other side there says it's more like unconscious thing, how to knowledge, and you've learned things with training and practice. So that's, in other words, declarative means explicit, and the procedural or skill, the unconscious ones, would be what? Implicit. Now, above working memory is kind of interesting. We've got these different loops and buffers and central executive and visual spatial sketchboard. It's sort of your working memory that you're working off of there. And this is another model. It's much bigger than the SAM model because it breaks it down into more pieces, but it's essentially the same idea. There's the pill to forget. I must have that in here twice. Where am I going here? I'm just going the wrong direction. There we go. So the capacity of short-term memory is, well, you learn, and you're learning the sounds and meanings of new words or seeing pictures while a storyteller tells a tale. And if we want to remember large amounts of that information, like with Dr. Seuss, and you kind of want to remember how to read, and the next time a kid reads it, they're kind of getting that sing-songy type ability to read it. Our recall will be easier if we can use chunking to group like pieces together. In some ways, that's the way this works with Dr. Seuss. You're learning the sounds and meanings of new words and seeing pictures while the storyteller tells a tale. So you're weaving that together. One fish, two fish, red fish, blue fish. I mean, those are visual clues and cues, and also the sing-songy kind of rhythm to it. I had a student last year who interviewed her father and did a memory experiment. This is her dad and Thanksgiving dinner. So it's real interesting if you want to check this out. It's pretty well done. And she looks at the difference between a recall and recognition, which is really kind of a key thing. We're going to get there in a second. The magic number, 7 plus or minus 2. And remember to pause these as you go through if you need to pause it and write some things down into your notes. But you've got the number 7, and plus 2 would get you up to 9. If you subtracted 2, it would get you down to 5. So 7 plus or minus 2 is anywhere from 5 to 9 digits. And the old rotary phone, which I have a picture up there in the top right corner, looks just like the phone I had in my house. It was a big yellow cord on this thing. That cord stretched all around the house, and we used to drag it into our bedrooms, the receiver, and being there talking. Chunking storage in short-term memory can kind of help you with this. If you want to remember large amounts of information, our recall would be easier if we use chunking to group information together. And in some ways we do that with area code. 412 was the area code I grew up with in Pittsburgh. Here, and it's still the only area code that they have there that I'm aware of. In Houston, you had 713 when I first moved here. Then there was 281 outside the loop. And now we've got other area codes. And it doesn't even matter where your location is. In Houston, you can have any of those area codes. But that was a way to chunk up and break down this information. If you look at the first 3 digits in a phone number, you separate the 3 out from the rest. It's only 7 digits to remember then. So if you kind of knew it was either 281 or 713, you had a pretty good way of remembering it. If you knew where they lived, inside or outside of the loop, you'd be able to get it pretty quickly. So remembering a 10-digit phone number is pretty easy if we remember the 334 pattern, especially if we already know the 3 for the area code. It's rather than trying to recall 10 unconnected or disconnected numbers. This is a psychologist at the bottom there. You see his picture, George Miller, who published this original theory in 1956. You'll see a lot on this on the web that says this is a myth, that this is crazy. Being able to come up with some tricks and mnemonics and ways of remembering large numbers like the Asian gentleman did, who was able to break the Guinness Book of World Records for reciting pi as far out as a whole day's worth, and he didn't take any breaks. There are ways you can increase this number. I'm not saying you can't, but for most people this is generally where you're at, 7 plus or minus 2. Now, this is fascinating video, so if you get some time, check it out. But it's a TED Talk. It's 20 minutes long. It's a TED Talk. But this man's a writer, and he goes to do a story on these memory contests. And he gets there to do the story, and he starts to realize, wow, I don't have much of a story here. What am I going to write about? That these guys who are regular, normal, average people are getting up there and reciting the phone book, and they're doing these amazing memory tricks. And he's like, I don't really know what to say about that. I don't even know how this works. So he started talking to some of them and figuring this out, and they started to explain to him how anybody can do it. You just have to attend to it and spend time on it every day. And if you did, you can remember anything you wanted to remember. I think it's really good for students to see, to realize that if you want to learn, if you spend the time at it, and there are certain little tricks and tips that he teaches you, but anybody can do these amazing feats of memory. You just have to really spend the time working on it and understand a process. And he uses a process based upon like coming up with very strange images to imagine people. And I've seen people come up with this for names. And I do something similar with names. I just play around and make a bunch of puns and be silly about it until the name sticks. But it's a sloppy process compared to what he's doing. It's pretty amazing. And what happens, and long story short here, you can watch it and see for yourself, but he becomes very good at doing these memory tricks himself, and that becomes a pretty good story because the author becomes a participant. And you can see more about it in there. Here's the Facebook. You only have 150 friends. I know I've mentioned this in class probably, and you should probably choose your friends wisely if there are only 150. But Dunbar's number is what they're talking about here. It's suggesting that a theoretical cognitive limit to the number of people whom one could be a friend with and maintain a stable social relationship is 150. And it says here that, you know, our memories can keep track of groups about this size, and beyond 150 our interactions become anonymous. We don't even really can't keep up with that many people. I think my number is shrinking and shrinking and shrinking as I get older, but past a group size of 150, we start needing like formal organizational structures to handle the interactions. Now, Facebook deals with this in a number of different ways, and we'll show some of those to you when we get a chance to look at problem solving in the next chapter here. But if you were to group people under like friends and then family or coworkers, or your friends from church, but your friends from basketball, but your friends from baseball, or whatever. Now you've got an organizational clustering that you might be able to have maybe a larger number of friends because you've got the clustering. But if you just stack them all up, okay, these are friends of mine, without any organization, it makes it pretty difficult to do. So organization is important for our brain. And the two biggest wrong assumptions that people make about long-term memory is that the capacity is unlimited, and it's not unlimited. It's pretty big, but it's not unlimited. And once we get the information into our brain, into long-term memory, it's locked in there forever. And that's definitely not true. We do more forgetting than we do remembering. And I've seen some veteran coaches say that they've forgotten more than some young whippersnapper kid has even learned, and it's probably true. The human brain has about 1 billion neurons, and for each neuron it forms about 1,000 connections to other neurons, amounting to about 1 trillion different connections. And I have no idea why this is doing this here, but each neuron combines so that each one would help us with memories. Let me pull this up and I'll fix it up here a little bit for us. It's interesting to look at this and think about it, and I've never had this happen before, but I've had some graphics problems here too. Interesting to look and think about this, because what we're dealing with this organizational deal here is just understanding that we have a way of accessing information, but it's not perfect. It's far from perfect, that's for sure. And we have an amazing ability in our brain to get to the bottom and find information. However, it's not perfect, and some people just assume that it is. Like, we can just pull up any information that we want whenever we want, and it just doesn't work that way. It's not like a DVR. Another way of looking at it is like a DVR you can hold so much information to, and then it runs out. We've got some different. It works a little differently. Human memory does, and it has potential to improve. So the comparison is, if your brain worked like a digital video recorder, how much room would you have? Well, 2.5 petabytes. This isn't terabytes or gigabytes or megabytes. This is petabytes, which is massive number. We'd be able to hold 3 million hours of TV shows. Now, that can't happen. So it's like kind of a process of like thinking about what if, if the brain was a computer, would it work in this way? We know that it doesn't work in this way, but if it did work that way, that's what we could do. That's what we could access. So it's kind of fascinating to think about and look at, even though it's not possible. It's sort of a mind exercise here, but bear with me. So let's flip back through this some more. Each neuron combines with other neurons, so you're getting closer to that 2.5 petabyte number, or 1,000,000 gigabytes is basically what we're looking at. It's interesting. It's interesting how the human mind has evolved and changed over time, and the brain capacity has widened and improved. So let's look at the organization of long-term memory. Just about finished here. Nodes and links. We discussed this with cognition earlier, and we activate or spread down a node. In psychology, the divided memory into, as we've mentioned before, explicit memories, where you're declaring or having a declarative memory. It's information that you're aware of, and it's in your brain, and now you're declaring it, like 1492. Columbus sailed the ocean blue. It's facts that you know. It's that sing-songy approach we've all heard before. An implicit memory is not facts and events that are divided into episodic and semantic. It's not a knowing fact, but it's a memory that influenced your behavior, but for which you have no conscious awareness of how you do this. It just does, like whether it's walking, chewing gum, whatever. These are more... And there are many more explicit memories that we work on than implicit. Okay, so it's something to consider. This, I'm going to play it for you real quickly here, is very interesting. This is what memory, thought, and cognition really look like. This is a fish, and you can see it firing, the neurons firing, and the kind of the thinking that it's doing. It's really fascinating. And that's what the human brain does too, all the connections we have. So studies have shown that musicians tend to have better memories than non-musicians, not just for music, but for words and pictures too. Interestingly, they tend to use different strategies for memorization, being more likely than non-musicians to group words in similar semantic categories, and less likely to verbalize pictures. I think that's really fascinating too. They're less likely to verbalize a picture. Do you have to remember things and think about things with language? That's a really good question, and we're going to get to talking about that in the next section here, which we'll talk about language and thought. So last part here, were you able to name the 7 doors to begin with? Maybe not, but can you now by looking at my list here? This is the difference between recognition, which this is, and recall, which we did earlier. So look at the list there, see if you can pick them out, pause the video, write down as many as you can find, and then unpause it and come right back right now. How many did you remember this time? So you got grumpy, sneezy, doc, happy, dopey, bashful, and sleepy. Were you able to do better this time than before? I would think most people would be a little bit better. And this is because it's the same reason you might want to have a multiple choice exam and not fill in the blank. With recall, you just must retrieve the information from your memory. You're filling in the blank, and that can be very difficult and much more strenuous. With recognition, you're looking at and to identify the target from a possible number of choices, and it's there. You just have to find it. You have to recognize it. So that's your multiple choice test. So which are easier for you? I would think the vast majority of you would say recognition. Here's another look at the cognitive cycle. You can pause this and check it out, but it goes through maybe in a more in-depth way than we've looked at before. Here is a penny. There is a penny on that list from A to O that is correct. I want you to pause it and study this and see if you can figure out which one is the right penny, and write down the letter in your notes, and then unpause it here in just a second right now, and we'll tell you. That's the one. So why do we have trouble finding the real penny? We don't have any need to know the details of a penny other than the color, the size, and the feel of it, right? So we don't memorize which way Lincoln's facing and what the words at the top and the bottom say either. So let's look back here. Which one is it? Which one is it? Oh man. Now this is tricky because the D that's on all of those coins next to the date, I think that's the mint location or something like that. So this one doesn't have that on there, but it's the first one. In God we trust, liberty. Lincoln is looking to that direction, and so you're seeing it in that way. But so how did you do? Most people have a difficult time picking that out. You see the different color of nickels there, and Lincoln there, and there's a whole bunch of information about why we call it, or I say nickels, pennies, what I meant to say. All these different ways of looking at the penny and why we do it. And John Green thinks that we really should not have or mint pennies anymore. They cost more to make for the government than they are worth, which is kind of crazy. Why do we keep doing this? And John Green, it's kind of hard to see him, but he's down here in this part right here, and he actually got to interview the president, and that's the question that he asked him. He also asked him what he should name his new baby, but Obama kind of punted that one and said he wasn't going to do it. But you can kind of see him doing this too. He's like, I think he knows it's kind of a silly thing that we keep making pennies, but people like pennies. They don't want to see them go away. It's a nostalgic thing. It's strange because I wonder if Abraham Lincoln would be so proud to be on a coin that does not even really have the value that you would think it would have. Like, I think, and he's already on the, what's the $5 bill, right? I mean, it's kind of silly. It's not like he's not on any other coin or dollars. So we discussed this earlier. This is the last part on cognition here, so I just want to mention this again. Is it possible that, like Google Glass, which this video is of, and I'm just going to play the first part of it here, is it possible that using Google Glass would help you, you look down and you can check your mail from your little Google Glass, you can see the weather, you can see all this information. Is it possible that that kind of thing would be able to give you improved cognition, improved memory, improved ability to make decisions, and improved ability to think? I think that's really a fascinating question, and one we'll have to see how it develops. But hopefully this helped you out a little bit with learning about cognition. We're wrapping up the first part of this 3-part series on unit number 4. We only have 2 units left after this one, but unit 4 is cognition, which involves memory, language, and thought. We've covered memory, language and thought is next, and then intelligence follows that. So this is a pretty big unit filled with lots of information. So hopefully you're watching the videos. If you have any questions, please do email me or stop by and see me in class. Until next time, don't forget to be awesome.